Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Tuesday night talk. We want to begin, as we do all of our evenings, by wishing all those who are ill in our community and the larger community a refuah shlema, and to express our condolences to all those who have lost loved ones during this very difficult time. We stand together as a community. We want to thank and recognize the amazing work of our health professionals who are on the front lines and literally doing God's work. Keep healthy and safe. Thank you all for being on with us this evening. Tonight we are proud and privileged to have a dynamic duo of Dr. Tevi Troy, class of '85, and Dr. Jon Jucovy, Ramaz multi-generational teacher, mentor, and friend. Tevi Troy is a best-selling presidential historian and former White House aide. From 2007 to 2009, Dr. Troy was the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the second in command and chief operating officer of the largest civilian department in the federal government. Dr. Troy served at the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy and was also the White House Jewish Liaison, acting as President Bush's main advisor on Jewish issues and the administration's point person for the Jewish community. He is the author of 4 books, including the new one that we will discuss this evening, The White House, Rivalries in the White House, from Truman to Trump. Dr. Troy has his PhD in American Civilization from the University of Texas, a BS from Cornell University. He currently lives in Kent Mill, Maryland, with his wife, Cami, and 4 children. Dr. Jon Jucovy. Dr. Jucovy was born exactly 8 years after the Pearl Harbor attack. Dr. Jacobi grew up in Great Neck, New York, during the 50s and 60s. Hard to believe, but that is so. His earliest memory, presaging his future career, was being hugged at the age of 2.5 by Governor Harriman at the Adlai-Stevenson presidential rally. He received his PhD in history at CUNY in 1985, writing his dissertation on Bavarian peasants in Nazi Germany. He had already begun teaching at the Ramaz Upper School in 1981, and then assumed the newly created history chairmanship in 1986. Now, aside from his sabbatical year at Dalton, he has been at Ramaz ever since. He has been blessed, as he often likes to say, with the finest students on this planet, including, of course, Tevi Troy, whom we will hear from this evening. We have actually been the ones who have truly been blessed having him for so many years at Ramaz. He presently lives in Great Neck, New York, where he is raised with his wife, Beth, a daughter and a son, who he wished had attended Ramaz, as he likes to tell us as well. Today, Dr. Jacobi is the Director of Humanities and History and the Department Chair of History at the Ramaz Upper School. Thank you both for agreeing to join us this evening and sharing your thoughts and ideas with all of us. Dr. Jacobi. Before we begin, I'm sorry, I just want to tell you something procedural. This evening you can't be seen or heard, but there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, which you can use to ask questions, and Dr. Jucovy throughout the evening will be taking those questions and posing them to Dr. Troy. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A. Dr. Jucovy, it is all now yours.
Thank you. Mr. Rockland left off his name among those students, but that's generous of him, as always. Welcome, everybody. I can't see you, but I can see your names, and I wish I can give a specific shout out to all of you, but again, it's good to so-called see you. in these unusual times. And welcome Tevi, class of '85, which is, when I taught ninth grade, the very first group that I ever taught. And I could still name all the students in that group. And you were not one of those in ninth grade. I had you later on. So I finished your book. I had an enormously educational, enjoyable read on White House. I'll certainly be utilizing some of that material in my classes. Let's start with what's the obvious but necessary question. And you'll describe the book, but why this book and why this time to write this book?
Well, thank you for the question. I'll just show the book off to people who want to see it. It's called White House, and it just came out in February. First of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Jucovy, for being such an excellent history teacher, and I learned so much from you, and I still remember your vivid description of the Schlieffen Plan that was one of the instigating events in World War I, and my daughter is about to take her AP Euro, and I explained the Schlieffen Plan as I learned it from you all those years ago, so thank you for that.
And you even pronounce it right.
Thank you. So I wrote this book because when I was looking for my next book topic about 3-4 years ago, there was a lot of conversation about this issue of White House infighting. And especially in early 2017, there was this whole sense that White House fighting is unprecedented. And whenever a historian hears the word unprecedented, they start to get nervous because we look for precedents. And so I actually went to libraries or Amazon to look for books on this topic of White House infighting. And I found none. There were no on the larger topic. There were on specific rivalries and specific administrations. There might be a book on administration that touched on rivalries, but nothing that was kind of a cross-cutting look at rivalries across multiple administrations. And there's the old story of the historian who goes to the library, back when we were able to go to libraries, but the historian who goes to the library and asks for a book on a subject and doesn't find it, so he decides to write it himself. And that's pretty much what I decided to do. Nobody had written this, so I wanted to undertake it and see if White House infighting is a frequent occurrence. Has it happened in the past? What are the causes? And most importantly, what, if anything, can presidents do about it if they so choose?
You know, you said the precipitating factor, the talk in 2017. So I'm actually going to start off with the particular, because that's one of the things that I was struck by in your book. And of course, being me, I have to do my research. I went and checked up on you and can report back that your description was accurate. The precipitating factor was all this talk about the contentiousness, the turnover, and the Trump administration. What actually is the historical comparison in terms of the infighting, the turnover of the Trump administration with previous presidential administrations?
Well, I always like to say that you can't tell the story until the story is over. So the analysis of the Trump administration, I do talk a little bit about the Trump administration in the book, is mostly a collection of journalistic accounts and some kind of quickie memoirs. So I don't think we know the full story of the Trump administration. And what I found with the Obama administration is if I had written this book during the Obama administration, I would have told a different story about the Obama administration than what we know now from some of the memoirs that have come subsequently. And with the Bush administration, similarly, the oral histories are now available and they weren't available before. So I think that the Trump administration is still a tale being told, but it's clear that there was a lot of infighting because in the Trump administration, especially in the early days, there were multiple factions in the White House. There's often ideological factions in the White House, but there are usually two. And in the Trump administration, in the early days, there appeared to be 3 warring factions, and I think that contributed to some of it. I also think that there's many easier ways to leak these days with all sorts of new technologies. There's also easier ways to discover the leakers. That's a different story, but I think that there are many more staffers today who have relationships with reporters than back in my day when I was working in the Bush White House, when it was really seen as improper and rare to be contacting reporters on a regular basis. So I think there were some things that were going on early in the Trump administration that raised a lot of alarm bells on fighting in the White House, but I am still wary of making a definitive statement about this White House until we have the whole story and the archives open up.
Do you want to, for a moment, share when you think that whole story will be?
Well, the Bush administration oral histories, which I think are immensely valuable, and I don't think I could have written this book as well as I did without the oral histories. Those came online in 2019, which is 10 years after the Bush administration ended. So the Trump administration oral histories, we should have them available in either 2031 or 2035, depending what happens in the November election. And I think they will tell a very interesting tale.
Okay, you began your book basically with the Truman administration. What led to that choice?
Well, the people think about a White House staff and they assume it was always thus. But the truth is there was not really a White House staff before the FDR administration. During the Franklin Roosevelt administration, there was a commission called the Brownlow Commission. And it issued a very famous conclusion, and it was that the president needs help, famous 4-word conclusion. And the Brownlow Commission said that the president should have help in terms of a series of administrative aids, with another famous quote from it, a passion for anonymity. The passion for anonymity has gone out the window, but the notion that the president needs assistance is something that developed mid-Roosevelt administration, and Harry Truman was the first president to enter with a White House staff as we know it today. Not completely as we know it today, but with an executive office of the president and multiple staffers who report to him. Before that, the cabinet members were the president's staff, and now you had the development of a White House staff. So to have kind of an equivalent look of each administration, I started with Truman because every administration from Truman through Trump has come in with a White House staff and had to figure out how to deal with it.
And let's go back to that Truman administration, because it's the first one. It establishes some of the patterns that you noted in your book. One of the things you spoke about was the a kind of 3-pronged test of determining how the infighting in the White House staff impacts policymaking and effectiveness of the presidency. So can you tell us a little bit about that test?
Sure. I established, after looking at all these administrations and trying to find patterns, because that's what I do as a historian, I'll look at the stories and then try and see what are the recurring patterns that tell you what it all means. And so I found really 3 things that determine the level of White House infighting. Number 1 is ideological alignment. If you have people who are at odds ideologically, as I alluded to before with the early days of the Trump administration and the 3 factions, if you have people who are at odds ideologically, you're going to see more fighting. People disagree on the nature and the direction in which the policy should go, they're going to fight more. So that's 1. Number 2 is process. Process is a kind of boring word, but within the White House, it's extremely important. I learned this when I was in the Bush administration. If you don't follow the process, you could get accused of what's known as the dreaded process foul. What process means is the way in which meetings are scheduled, the way in which policy decisions get determined, what meetings reach the level of the president, what kind of paper the president gets in order to make his decisions, and who are the participants in those meetings. And those are all important process questions. And when you have a clean process, people can feel, even if they disagree with the eventual conclusion, that they went in front of the president, they had their say, the president decided a different way, but at least they had a chance to say it, and then they could kind of lock arms afterwards and unite about what the eventual decision of the administration is. If you don't have that fair process, you're going to have people fighting and looking for alternative ways to get their message out, whether it's circumventing the process and going straight to the president, or worse, circumventing the process and going to the media to air out your grievances. And then the third is presidential tolerance. Does a president want to see infighting, or does the president say, enough of this, I don't want to see it, I will fire people who engage in it? And those 3 things really determine the level of infighting. That doesn't mean you can eliminate it completely, but they determine there's a scale, and you can have more infighting or less infighting, and those 3 things are the number 1 levers that presidents have to shape this.
So I want to come back to some of those things in a moment or two, but let's talk about the Truman administration, where I think the central part of that chapter was infighting that involved a story that's become iconic within the Jewish community. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. In the Truman administration, there was a big fight over the question of whether to recognize Israel. This sounds strange to our ears today, as Israel and the US are very close allies, and it's been a very storied and productive partnership. But at the time, there was a real question. Should we recognize this little country that doesn't have oil, that doesn't have that many people, and is surrounded by more populous nations with a lot more oil power and just more sway in the world, and they're going to be there, and this little Jewish state may not be. So the prevailing wisdom in the national security establishment at the time was not to recognize the state of Israel. And George Marshall, who was one of the generals who helped win World War II, was the Secretary of State and was the person that Truman revered more than anyone else in public life. He was adamantly opposed to recognizing Israel. Truman wanted to have a fair process, like I talked about earlier, and he set up a meeting in the White House where Marshall would make the case for not recognizing Israel. And on the other side was Clark Clifford, who at the time was a very junior White House aide, but he was a trained attorney and had done trials, and he kind of knew how to make an argument. And Truman had this meeting set up where Clifford made the argument for recognizing Israel, and he did it quite effectively. Marshall, who was part of this national security establishment that was so certain that we shouldn't recognize Israel that he didn't really do his prep work for it. He just kind of sneeringly looked at Truman and said, "What's Clifford doing here?" Meaning, why is this junior aide in my face and arguing against me, the great and august Marshall? But Clifford's argument won the day. After the meeting, Truman looked at Clifford, because the Secretary of State went back to the State Department, but Clifford was at the White House, and I talk a lot in the book about this rule of propinquity or proximity. If you're closer to the president, you have an edge in these fights. But Truman looks at Clifford and says, "Wow, that was rough as a cob," meaning the meeting was a very uncomfortable meeting. But Truman sides with Clifford. And Marshall, Secretary of State, is so angry that he never again speaks to Clifford or utters his name for the rest of his life. When I was going through the archives and I came across that delicious detail, I said, that's got to go in the book. So we hear, actually, we have heard of a number of circumstances in the Trump administration of people being so mad that they don't talk to each other. But there's a long and storied history of not being willing to talk to your enemies in the White House. And it goes back to this Clifford-Marshall fight over Israel.
I think what struck me as unusual about that story is it's hard to imagine nowadays a person, even of the prestige and esteem of George Marshall, speaking to the president the way he spoke to him at that meeting. Is that true?
Yeah, the word chutzpah came to mind. Marshall even said that he wouldn't vote for Truman in the next election if Truman went against his wishes, which is
right.
Really
and I told that face to face.
Right, and I wanted to use the word chutzpah in the book, but this audience gets it, but I wasn't sure that the wider audience I was aiming for in this case would.
And you don't want Alan Dershowitz to get on your case.
Right, that's true.
Nobody wants that. I was actually going to bring up your law of propinquity. I always have to pause for a moment before pronouncing it. So talk about some of the factors that play a role in determining who has the propinquity to the president.
Yeah. So there's two types of propinquity. One is, and propinquity is a nice word for proximity, but I just like the ring of law of propinquity. And I can't tell you how many people have read the book and they said, but I had to look up that P word. But in any event, there's two types. There's one is proximity to the president, meaning are you situated in the White House or are you situated at one of the cabinet agencies? And in the Carter administration chapter, I talk about how Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor, had this massive advantage over his chief rival, Cyrus Vance, who was the Secretary of State, because the papers were written, the meeting notes were written at the White House. And Vance objected that he didn't have a crack at those papers. And Brzezinski kind of said, well, aw shucks, you could come over to the White House anytime you want and look at them. They're classified, only you could look at them. So it's not like you can send an aide. And there was no way that Vance, who was incredibly busy as Secretary of State, was going to come over from Foggy Bottom to the White House to look at the meeting notes every day. And so Brzezinski had this huge advantage. So that's one thing. Are you at the White House or are you at the executive agencies? But the second law of propinquity, and there's a lot of elbowing within the White House about this, is how close are you to the president? Is your office next to the Oval Office, or are you in the Eisenhower Executive Office building across the street? Are you on the main floor of the West Wing, which is where the president is, or are you on the second floor, which is you have to go up and down stairs to get to him? So these questions really help determine policy. And in fact, in the Ford administration, which we're probably going to talk about more, there was one aide who was a particularly nettlesome aide who set himself up in the anteroom outside the Oval Office and set up shop there and was able to do a great deal of mischief from that position until it came to a relatively young deputy chief of staff at the time named Dick Cheney to figure out a way to supplant that guy and get him out of that office from which he was causing all that trouble.
And what did he figure out?
So the guy is a guy named Robert Hartman, and he was Ford's chief of staff as vice president, but he didn't have the skills or talent to be chief of staff to the president, which is a very big administrative job. But he was close to Ford and knew Ford for a long time. So when Ford elevated from vice president to president after Nixon resigned in the wake of Watergate, this guy Hartman just set up shop in that anteroom right outside the Oval. And because he was close to Ford, nobody wanted to force him out or go to the president and say, you've got to get this guy out of there. But what Cheney did was very clever. He went to Ford and he said, Mr. President, you really need a room for quiet reflection and contemplation. And in that room near your office, you can sit and stew and think about issues and make big, important strategic decisions. And Ford said, yeah, that's a great idea. And so once he had that sign off from Ford, Ford kicked this guy Hartman out of his office, and Hartman reported that he came and found his office door sealed the next day he showed up to work. So Cheney was very good at using the bureaucratic structures to get what he wanted, but he had to do it by kind of tricking Ford.
Now, aside from bureaucracy, propinquity also involves sometimes more, sometimes less, family members. So what are some of the most outstanding examples of where there's been some significant fighting, real battles, because of people who are actually related to the president having his ear or actually being in the capacity of, official capacity?
Oh, yeah, there's so much family stuff in this book. Well, first of all, the greatest fight I think I uncover in the book, or that I talk about in the book, is the fight between Robert F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson in the Kennedy administration, and going over into the Johnson administration. Robert F. Kennedy was obviously John F. Kennedy's brother, and he was the Attorney General, and he was by far the most powerful official next to the president in the thousand days of the Kennedy administration. Lyndon Johnson was vice president, and he was always shunted aside. He was disliked by Robert F. Kennedy, but what they had between them was a shifting power dynamic, because when Johnson was in the Senate, Robert F. Kennedy was a relatively low-level staffer, and so Johnson could lord it over him then. And then in the administration, Robert F. Kennedy was the most powerful official next to the president, and he lorded it over Johnson, including often humiliating him and taking away responsibilities from him. And there was one time when he did something to Johnson that made Johnson so upset that one of Johnson's aides said he looked like he'd been smacked in the face with a fish. And then the third power dynamic shift happens when Kennedy is tragically assassinated. And suddenly Robert F. Kennedy goes from brother of the president and attorney general and most respected aide to most hated person in the administration by Johnson. And in fact, shortly after the Kennedy assassination, there is a meeting of the cabinet, Johnson's first cabinet meeting as president, and Kennedy comes late to the meeting. Johnson feels like Robert F. Kennedy, is trying to show him up, and they have a shouting match in the Oval Office. And after that, Kennedy and Johnson didn't speak for 2 months. Now, there's lots of people in my life I go without speaking for 2 months, but not when they're the sitting attorney general and I'm the president. So that was a pretty unusual circumstance, but that power dynamic shifted, and suddenly Kennedy, who'd been lording it over Johnson, was now beneath him and suffering as a result.
Now, what about presidential wives? I'm actually particularly interested because I teach about this, about the role of Nancy Reagan.
Yeah, well, Nancy Reagan was the other person I was thinking could have been referring to the Johnson story or the Reagan story, but Nancy Reagan was very powerful in the Ronald Reagan administration. She was his closest confidant, and people knew that they had to get on Nancy's good side or they'd be in trouble. And in fact, Michael Deaver, who was deputy chief of staff, was very good at dealing with Mrs. Reagan, and people jokingly said that he had the mommy watch because Reagan used to call his wife mommy. But not every aide knew how to stay on Mrs. Reagan's good side. And Don Regan, who was the chief of staff in the second term, taking over for Jim Baker, who did a very good job in the first term, but Don Regan takes over in the second term and doesn't know how to deal with Reagan, but also really doesn't know how to deal with Nancy. And when the Iran-Contra scandal happens, Nancy is giving direction. Reagan doesn't want to take it. Doesn't want to take it. Nancy says about him, he's pretty good at the chief part, but not so good at the of staff part. And they have a fight where Don Regan, the chief of staff, hangs up on Mrs. Reagan, the first lady. And Jim Baker who was the chief of staff in the first term and knows about how to deal with Mrs. Reagan, said, hanging up on the president, that's not just a firing offense, that's a hanging offense. And indeed, Don Regan wasn't around much longer after that incident.
The word is, at least I've read in some places, that Ms. Reagan was very, very responsible for trying to sweep out a group of advisors whom she felt had kind of entrapped her husband, the president, into things like the Iran-Contra. Is that true to your understanding?
It's true, but it's not. It wasn't always so clear who all the participants were and who was responsible for what. So I think she was very interested in kind of cleaning up the mess. And Reagan complained about cleaning up after the elephants in the parade because he felt like he was constantly trying to deal with mess. But they definitely got rid of some of the folks. In fact, Bud McFarlane, who was the national security advisor, was one of the people involved in it, and he ended up leaving the White House, but he also apparently tried to commit suicide unsuccessfully. And Don Regan, quite cruelly, was said to have said, he can't even get that right. Okay. So people can get really nasty in these circumstances.
Do you think that the situation nowadays with the president's relatives, his daughter and son-in-law, is therefore not unusual?
It's a good question. I mean, obviously, the first lady is a constant, right? There's always a first lady situation, whether positive or negative, but the first lady is always going to be there, and is one of the two people, along with the vice president, the president can't fire. After the Kennedy administration, they put an anti-nepotism law in place, so you really couldn't have another attorney general who was a relative of the president. But the White House aide situation is a little more of a gray area, I suppose. And so we haven't had something like the Jared Ivanka situation for a while, and it's not clear that we'll have it again. And I think it is a somewhat unusual circumstances, but there are historical precedents, even if they're not immediate historical precedents.
So is fighting within the White House staff or between cabinet staff, is it ever productive?
Yes, it is. And my favorite example here is in the Bill Clinton administration. Bill Clinton is elected in 1992. He initially taxed to the left, and there was a kind of push against that in the 1994 election, where a Republican Congress, both House and Senate, are Republican for the first time in 40 years. Clinton realizes he's drifted too far to the left, and he brings in Dick Morris, who is at the time was a very well-known political consultant, but who had started in Democratic politics, actually in Manhattan Democratic politics, but had been drifting right over time. And Clinton brings in Dick Morris to kind of center him a little bit more. But Dick Morris is, first of all, initially, he is a secret aide. He's got a code name, Charlie, and nobody knows who it is, but they would see presidential speeches get rewritten, presidential decisions get changed, and they were wondering what happened, and it was the influence of this guy, Charlie. But once he is revealed or outed, and people know who he is, Harold Ickes, who hated Morris for 30 years, dating back to their time in New York Democratic politics, and George Stephanopoulos, who hated Morris for ideological reasons, they both work against him the entire time, and they're constantly at odds. But in Stephanopoulos' book, All Too Human, which is one of the best White House staff memoirs, if you're interested in this kind of thing, is one I would recommend. But Stephanopoulos writes about the Morris situation, that even though he hated Morris and was at odds with him the entire time, that Clinton got better results out of his staff as a result of the tension that happened by bringing in Morris to have a more conservative influence to kind of counterbalance the liberal influence of people like Ickes and Stephanopoulos.
I saw Sarah Ney Mordukowitz in the audience. She and I used to always talk about Dick Morris. She had some interesting insights about him. Okay, what I want is your judgment on the opposites. The best, not necessarily in terms of production of infighting, but you think the most productive White House staff, maybe you'll say Clinton again, and the worst presidential example in terms of what you discuss in your book.
When you say worst example, you mean in terms of most infighting?
Yeah, the most infighting, that would be the worst, and the best handled staff. Maybe that would just be repeating Clinton again. But what was the worst in that case?
So I would say the worst was the Ford administration, 895 days of pure fighting. People don't think about it because Jerry Ford was a nice guy, and he's one of the number one characteristics about him is that he was a nice guy. But the fact of the matter is, in some ways, his niceness counted against him because he wasn't willing to do the tough things that were needed to sort out some of the problems in the staff. But this guy, Robert Hartman, whom I mentioned earlier, was a bit of an egomaniac and was constantly causing trouble. Everyone disliked him on the staff. In fact, his nickname was SOB, which he jokingly said stood for Sweet Old Bob, but we know that it probably stood for something else. And you just had constant fighting. And in fact, there was a famous event called the Halloween Massacre, where Ford just kind of wiped out much of his staff as a way to try to wipe the slate clean. And that's what elevated Don Rumsfeld, who was the chief of staff, to the Defense Department. And then Dick Cheney, who was the deputy chief of staff, became the chief of staff. And then as part of this, Nelson Rockefeller, who was the vice president, was told that he's not going to be on the vice presidential ticket for 1976. So there were a number of big moves that happened as part of that Halloween massacre. That was how Ford tried to control it, but it was really too little, too late. So I think that was the most contentious White House staff that I studied. In terms of best or least fighting, in some ways, there's no one White House staff that I can point to and say that was perfect. I would say there are aspects of them. So, for example, the George W. Bush administration, there was tons of fighting on the foreign policy side, but the defense side seemed to get along pretty well, according to, I was there, so I'm a biased observer, but according to external observers, they said that one got along well. But again, that was the domestic side, not the foreign policy side. And then you correctly mentioned Clinton. I would say the first term Clinton, there was a lot of fighting, as I suggested, with Stephanopoulos and Morris and David Gergen also in the early days. But in the second term, as Clinton was facing impeachment, there was kind of a circle the wagons approach, and all the people who had been fighting in the first term suddenly said, we've got bigger fish to fry, and let's try and fight the Republicans. And there's a great quote in the book from Barney Frank's sister, who worked in the White House, and she said, her name's Ann Lewis, and she said, Newt Gingrich, Henry Hyde, you want me to side with them? So she was viscerally reacting to Republican trying to force.
I'm not sure if it's happening for everybody.
Behavior is people should have been, but she was unhappy with the behavior. But at the same time, she recognized that there was a larger enemy that they were fighting.
Okay, we're having, at least on my end, there's a little bit of a breakup here. I'm hoping it's not true for everybody as well. So I want to remind people that they're welcome to post on the Q&A questions, which I will pose to Mr. Troy. So please, I encourage you to do that. What about the comparison in terms of that so very different systems, the American White House versus the Israeli prime ministership? Is there a similar kind of infighting that takes place? Similar sorts of patterns that you're aware of in Israel?
Yeah, oh my gosh, yes. But let me just first say that I noticed that Esther Nussbaum posted a comment about Eddie Jacobson's important role in helping convince Truman on the Israel front. And it is true, and I mentioned it in the book, but I talk about it at greater length in my book, What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted, which talked about some of the outside influences that helped develop Truman's position on Israel. But it is true, but this book was really focused on the fighting that led to the issue. But it is true that Eddie Jacobson, Truman's haberdashery friend, and partner, was part of that decision-making process. In terms of Israeli politics, I actually wrote a piece for Tablet magazine, and I did it with our friend, your former student, David Samuels, who helped work with Tablet magazine. And it was about rivalries in Israeli politics. And there are some unbelievable stories. And again, this is not cross-party. So, if Begin and Rabin hate each other, there are cross-party rivals that I don't talk about. But I'm talking about internal rivals, people who were supposedly on the same side. And one of the worst was Golda Meir was often fighting, and she and Abba Eban were at each other's throats. And there's a great story that I have in this article where Golda Meir is told that she should be nicer to Abba Eban but Abba Eban speaks 5 languages, And she cuttingly says, "So does the waiter at the King David Hotel." And then there's another similar story where she's told that Abba Eban is thinking of running for prime minister of Israel. And her, again, cutting response is, "Prime minister of what country?" So there was a lot of rivalry and tension between the two of them. Of course, the most famous and greatest rivalry in Israeli political history is between Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, which I talked a lot about in the piece. They were at each other's throats for multiple decades. And there were huge implications. And one of the stories I tell is that they were at odds on the Entebbe raid in 1976. And afterwards, they both tried to take credit and blame the other for trying to be slower on it. And one of the things that Peres did to show that he was the real champion of the Entebbe raid, which I think the historical record demonstrates that he was more in favor as defense minister than Rabin was as prime minister. But one of the things that Peres did was he embraced the family of Yoni Netanyahu, who is famously the only soldier killed on that raid and the head of the raid. And the family of Yoni Netanyahu obviously included Binyamin, now Bibi Netanyahu. And by embracing the family and going to the Shiva and helping Netanyahu get started in Israeli politics, he actually created the career of the person who is now not only the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, but also the one who defeated him after Rabin's tragic assassination. So there were huge implications to that fight between Rabin and Peres.
We have a question about the Reagan administration and James Baker. You did not name that as the most admirable or most effective of ways to run the White House, but the questioner is asking, wasn't that a well-run White House operation?
Oh, it absolutely is. It was a very well-run White House. James Baker was perhaps the best chief of staff, but there was a lot of fighting, so it's clear. In fact, one of the inspirations for this book was early in 2017, I was listening to a podcast where Peter Robinson, who was a Reagan speechwriter, was talking about all the media reports about fighting in the current White House. And Robinson said, well, of course we had fighting in the Reagan White House. We just didn't have Twitter, tweeter, twatter talking about it. So the Reagan White House was known as a White House where there was a lot of fighting, but I would say that in many cases it was productive fighting that did lead to better results for the president, at least in the first term, because they got a lot accomplished. And what happened was that James Baker, again, it was his consummate operator, was named chief of staff. He was Bush's campaign manager, so he was seen as the enemy by the old Reagan staff, especially the conservative Californians. And he's brought in over Ed Meese, who becomes counselor to the president. Reagan tells Baker as chief of staff, make it right with Ed, meaning don't alienate Ed Meese. And so they have this famous list that I talk about in the book where they divvy up the White House responsibilities. And the ones that Baker gets are the ones that really operate the place, whereas the ones that Meese gets are more honorific. So Meese gets cabinet rank and he becomes counselor to the president, but Baker runs the legislative strategy group, which was the true powerful committee in the White House that helped determine how they were going to get things done. So again, Baker, consummate operator, a very successful White House, I would say, but you can't say there was no fighting there.
Here's a very interesting question. And I'm going to add my own twist to it as well. Are there any particular cabinet positions that have become more influential over time? And here's my little twist. Does the cabinet even matter anymore?
Yeah, so some things that become less influential over time. So remember, the Postmaster General in the 19th century was a hugely important position. Everybody knew who the Postmaster General was, and now that person is less important. I would say the Secretary of State is very important, but once you have the rise of a national security advisor, you have less clarity about who is the top advisor to the president on foreign policy. I would say that some of the cabinet agencies like HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, was a joint agency until the Carter administration. Carter breaks it out, and now we have a Department of Health and Human Services, which is very powerful, and a separate education department. So there are all kinds of twists, and then you have new departments like the Department of Homeland Security, which I think is a very influential department. And but again, that didn't exist before 9/11 and the Bush administration.
Who's your of all the characters that you study, and I do mean the word characters, this is another question from the audience. Who's your favorite survivor?
Yeah, it's a great question because there are so many characters in this book, so many sharp-elbowed individuals. I really, when I say favorite, what I mean is there are perhaps the most stories about him. But David Gergen, I think, is fascinating because he shows up in the Nixon administration, in the Ford administration, in the Reagan administration, and then oddly in the Clinton administration. And the Clinton administration is looking for someone, kind of an old Washington hand, to tell them how the White House works, but they're a little down on people from the Carter administration because Carter was an administration that was seen as a failed administration. So there weren't great relations between Carter and Clinton. So you didn't have a lot of the top Carter people come into that administration. So Gergen was a guy who was relatively moderate and also someone who had a lot of White House experience and a lot of fighting in every administration. And he was really disliked in the Reagan administration. And Larry Speakes was a guy who particularly disliked him. He was the press secretary. And Speakes used to play jokes on Gergen. Number one was Gergen was quite tall. And so he would nickname him the tall guy as a way to diminish him. And it eventually became just the name Tall. And then another thing that he did was he would lower, or he'd have one of his aides lower the podium before Gergen would go out to speak, and then he would tighten the screws really tight so that Gergen couldn't lift the podium, and he would look absurdly tall, towering above this relatively small podium. So I think some of just the fact that Gergen made it through 4 different White Houses and was involved in fighting in all of them. One other great Gergen story is that he leaked to the press so much that his nickname was Professor Leaky in the Reagan administration. And in that very famous scene after Reagan is shot, when they're in the Situation Room, and from here is when Al Haig runs up the stairs and says, "I'm in charge here," even though he's told not to do it, and kind of destroying the rest of Al Haig's reputation in perpetuity. But in that room, Gergen kept excusing himself, perhaps to go to the bathroom, but some of Gergen's aides thought he was excusing himself to go find a phone so he could leak to reporters about what was happening.
About what Haig was doing?
Well, Haig ran up the stairs to go talk to the White House press corps, but Gergen left the room perhaps to call reporters. And so either he was going to the bathroom or he was leaking to reporters. Either way, the name Professor Leaky, I guess, was apt in that situation.
That's right. It works both ways. You may not be able to answer this question. Is there anybody that you, I'm not going to use the word despise, denigrate more than any other staffer? Feel free to pass on that, Tevi.
Look, I think the guy who comes off the worst, and deservedly, is probably that guy Bob Hartman in the Ford administration. He was a good writer, and he wrote that famous phrase, "Our long national nightmare is over." But even in the context of writing that phrase, he was quite obstinate, and he told Ford that if Ford didn't include that phrase in the speech about Nixon and Watergate, that he would resign. So he was constantly a bit of a troublemaker, and so I would say in some ways he's the biggest character and the one person I probably denigrate the most.
Now, one of the patterns that I notice, and a questioner is asking about this, is those times when either because of an assassination or President Nixon's resignation, when you have a holdover staff, often intensely loyal to the now gone president, and then you have the new staff come in. Is there any president who actually succeeded in navigating that very, very fraught process?
In a way, the answer is just by definition no, because every president wants to bring in their own people. Now, Lyndon Johnson, after Kennedy is assassinated, begs the Kennedy people to stay on. He says, I need you more than Kennedy did. He used his kind of typical Johnson cajolery and flattery to get people to stay, but he didn't actually want to use them. So somebody like Arthur Schlesinger is begged by Johnson to stay on, but Johnson doesn't really use him. And in fact, what Johnson does is create a parallel White House staff of people who are loyal to him, who are getting all the work and doing everything. And the Kennedy people are kind of left aside, and eventually they kind of filter out and they leave. But Johnson thought the symbolism of keeping the Kennedy people, at least for the early months, was really important.
Now, one of the other things I was seeing in the book, came up a few times, you're mentioning Johnson reminds me of that, is the role of higher educational establishments and the role of inferiority complex that some people have. Could you talk about that, where it comes up in your book, both with Johnson and as well as others, some of the staffers?
Yeah, I mean, Johnson looked down on the Kennedy people and called them the Harvards. There was a lot of top professors who worked in the administration. But there's also a great story in the Obama administration, which we haven't talked about much, where the press secretary, Robert Gibbs, and the deputy chief of staff, Alyssa Mastromonaco, are in this meeting. And they are the only two people around this big table without Ivy League degrees. And one of the Ivy Leaguers at the table makes some denigrating comment about where they went to college. And Mastromonaco reports in her memoir that she kind of blushed and was silent and she didn't know what to say. But Gibbs, being a press secretary, he knew what to say and he gave as good as he got. And he said something, I'm paraphrasing, along the lines of, yeah, well, you know, you went to these fancy colleges and we all ended up in the same place, meaning here at the White House. So we got the better end of the deal with our state college tuitions.
Do you think it worked? The comeback?
Well, I think it worked in that it ended up in Mastromonaco's memoir. And
right.
a lot of these memoirs, the comeback that shows up is the one that lives on in history. And there might have been a better comeback that came after, but that's not the story Mastromonaco wanted to tell. So it worked for her purposes.
Now, from someone who certainly knows his way around White Houses, Jay Lefkowitz wants to know if there's a special position or group that causes the most trouble, regardless of the administration.
Well, Jay and I worked together, and he kindly brought me into the George W. Bush White House. So he really does know White Houses. Look, I'm going to do a little bit of a dig back at Jay, because I think what causes the most trouble are offices that are not designated to do something that end up doing it. So in the Bush White House, the first Bush White House where Jay served, he was in cabinet affairs. The domestic policy staff was, or the domestic policy process was dysfunctional. And so cabinet affairs went, and they had some very bright young people in there, including Jay Lefkowitz, but also a guy named Dan Cass. And that they went and they created a kind of shadow policy operation. Now, I laud what they did in there because I think they brought out some good ideas. But I think if you have people who are outside the normal chain of command who are doing things, I think sometimes that leads to trouble. The other thing I think in general, and when I was advisor on the Romney campaign in 2012, when we talked about White House structure, he obviously didn't win, but there was a transition where we talked about it. I'm very concerned about ministers without portfolio. If you have somebody who just works in the White House as senior advisor to the president, but isn't in charge of specific things, that often leads to trouble. And Valerie Jarrett was a kind of a senior advisor without portfolio to some degree in the Obama White House, and there were a lot of. She also was known as someone who circumvented the process. She would go to the Obamas at night and try and go around what decisions had been made in the day, and for that reason, she was known as the Night Stalker among aides who didn't really appreciate her approach. That's
the title of a good movie, also. Actually, I misrepresented. That was not Jay Lefkowitz's question, but it's a good question. But here's another question that does come from Jay, and that is, and this is something that I'm fascinated about because it connects to the issue of the deep state, if there is such a thing as a deep state. Is there a precedent for a president whose White House staff deliberately tries to keep issues out of the Oval Office, as we're seeing with the current incumbent, other than perhaps the end of the Wilson presidency, when he was simply not competent to run the government?
The whole idea of a policy process is that some issues should be elevated to the president's desk and some issues should not. And the kind of the skill, and Jay was very good at this, of a person who runs a policy council is knowing which issues should be elevated, which issues could be decided at a lower thing. And Colin Powell has this great analysis where he talks about how the easy decisions, the 90-10 decisions, are made by regional career people far away from Washington. And the tougher the decisions, the 80-20 decisions, 70-30 decisions, they get elevated with the regional office. They start to come to Washington, to the agency headquarters. And then 60-40, these decisions start coming to the White House. And the toughest decisions, the 50.5 to the 49.5 decisions, where it's really not clear which direction you should go, those ones that end up in the Oval Office at the president's desk. So I think there's lots of decisions that don't make it to the president. And the the art or the skill of a good policy advisor and runner of a policy council is to know which decisions go at which level.
Do you have any examples of where there's actual, if I can use this term, sabotage of what is the known intention of the president, keeping things from him, or let's say tabling, losing, putting in the drawer something that has been decided upon as a directive? Do you have examples of that where?
Yeah, I would say in the Obama administration, Larry Summers intentionally kept some policy options away from Obama on the sides of the stimulus. And the head of the Council of Economic Advisors at the time was very angry with him for not bringing those decisions, not bringing those options to the president. She ended up leaving after a relatively brief tenure. And then also in the Ford administration, I mentioned this guy Hartman a couple of times, but Hartman would famously kind of lord over the president's inbox when he had that anteroom outside the Oval Office, and he would kind of swipe out items in the presidential inbox that he didn't like and give them to the famous political columnists Evans and Novak.
Yeah.
And if there were items that he wanted to get in there without going through the staff process, he would shove them into the presidential inbox without being vetted. So yeah, there are sometimes there are bad actors who do that.
We're going to wrap this up. Tevi,
come across this time.
Yeah, I want to thank you very much. Remember, you've made a promise to still come into my class. One of these times, if we ever have a class in the building. Otherwise, we can do it this way. And Mr. Rockland, I'm turning it back over to you.
So I want to say a special thank you to Dr. Tevi Troy, class of 85. Big shout out to the class of 85. Dr. Jon Jucovy, who never ceases to amaze us. I think we had an amazing opportunity to hear these two outstanding scholars, and we will look forward to you being with us in person in the future. We have some great stuff coming up, and I want to just encourage people to join us for the upcoming Zooms that we will have. First, on Thursday, we have a night at the museum with Ronit Wasserman. This is a second part in something that she did very popular. Please look out for that in your Zoom. There will be on a Sunday midday, we will have the pleasure of having Yaakov Katz, moderated by Dr. Beverly Gribbetz. Dr. Beverly Gribbetz will be moderating a talk about Yerushalayim with Yaakov Katz, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. And then Monday night, we will have the pleasure of a conversation between Dr. Sarah Schlesinger Hirschfeld, led by Rabbi Steinmetz, and they will be discussing the pandemic. And Dr. Schlesinger is a foremost expert in the area of studying viruses, and she will shed a lot of light for us. And then we are graced on Tuesday night talk next week with Rabbi Lookstein, who will be giving something. Actually, Tevi Troy has heard a piece of this before, but Rabbi Lookstein says that it is a whole new approach. It's called the 6-Day War, a twofold watershed moment for the Jewish people. And Rabbi Lookstein very much is looking forward to giving it, and all of us that have been hearing his Zooms are very much looking forward to hearing it. So please join us for that. There will be several other virtual campus moments. Please join us. Please keep in touch with us. If you'd like to sponsor one of these Zooms, please be in touch. Very easy to get in touch with me through the Ramaz site. But please, we want everyone to continue to share this with others. Join us. Stay healthy and safe. And thank you for being with us this evening. Take care and have a good one.
And you're still trying to fit in the Bavarian peasants, right? Okay, Tevi, thank you very much.